No, I'm not gonna say it this time. Since the beginning, I've started these Christmas specials by accidentally jinxing the world with that same painful line. Oh, this year sucked, but next year will be better, and look where that brought us. After everything we had to put up with this year, I'd rather not tempt fate again, especially seeing how harsh the effects were this year alone. So I'm just gonna skip the speech this year and pray that next year's gonna be tolerable for once. Now that we've got the dramatic vent out of the way, Merry Christmas, everyone! Christmas is here once again. That time of year where I can find more ease brushing aside all this negativity to make room for the festive spirit. Looking forward to seeing family, doing the gift exchanges, chowing the dinner, and then simmering down to enjoy some Christmas movies. In the past, I've talked about some highly beloved movies to enjoy this time of year, like some Christmas Carol movies and some Rankin Bass movies. But this year things are gonna be kinda different, as I had the curiosity to look at some not so beloved movies. Scratch that. These are considered among the worst of Christmas films. They battle neck to neck for the position of the all-time worst. And they go by the following titles: Rapsittie Street Kids Believe in Santa, and The Christmas Tree. Both films turn out to be so problematic, it's a nightmare to sit through them. Although I dare say, despite how awful they are, it's still possible to say one's better than the other. But before going into that, we should first go into some of the history behind these films, just to have an idea of what we're getting ourselves into. The Christmas Tree was the first of these films to come to life, as it first aired back in 1991, and brought to us by Flammarion Ferreira and Renato Almeida. Something tells me I've pronounced those horribly wrong. From what I've read, Ferreira carried most of this weight on her shoulders, from animating and character designs to straight up directing and producing. Fortunately for her, this wasn't the only chance she had in the animation field. She also provided some behind-the-scenes help for some of the Land Before Time movies, which sounds promising enough, but once she's given the chance to make her own project...
But after he left a donation collected by the townspeople for the orphanage, Mrs. Mavilda would immediately take off the child's clothes.
Oh boy, this completely turns the tables. But it wouldn't be fair to point all our fingers at her nor Almeida. They weren't the ones who primarily focused on the story itself. That's where Nils Christensen comes in. He was put in charge of the writing for this movie, and as I'll explain later, that's gonna end up being one of the most painful elements from this disaster of a movie. Heck, some have even gone as far as to say this is the worst Christmas movie of all time. Until years later, when the big challenger was given its spotlight. It wasn't until a decade later when Rapsittie Street Kids hit the scene. It made its debut back in 2002. Whoa, hold it. You're telling me this movie's turning 20 this year? I swear, I wasn't planning this video for the occasion. This was sheer coincidence. So this special was put together by the members of J. Rose Productions and Wolf Tracer Studios. But the big oof moment for this movie came from J. Rose, specifically from one of the producers, Chris Rose, as he practically had his back turned away from the team for pretty much the whole production, and he never looked back until it was too late when the movie first aired, which gave birth to the infamous tale that was Rapsittie Street Kids. A film that, despite how bad it was still anticipated to have sequels, like at the end of this movie where they advertise an Easter special. But after 20 years, I think it's fair to say that will never see the light of day. So, what are these movies about? Well, first there was The Christmas Tree, a story about an orphanage run by the sinister Mrs. Mavilda, who uses the orphans for profits which she uses later for gambling. The kids placed all their hope into this nearby tree which they call Mrs. Hopewell. But what happened to Mr. Hopewell?
She doesn't like to talk about it.
Things start changing after Judy starts working there. Oh, and she has a husband, Ray, but he contributes nothing to the story anyway. So Judy and her kids do everything they can to help the kids feel more comfortable, even if the kids make us uncomfortable. And what's any of this got to do with Christmas? Well, the kids start looking forward to Santa, and they make an attempt to find him at the North Pole, but that doesn't matter either since he arrives as a Deus Ex Machina. But also to decorate Hopewell, a nice touch I'll admit, but for real, this tree's getting way too much worship. Maybe Mavilda was onto something.
I'm cutting her down for firewood.
Or maybe not. Now on to Rapsittie Street Kids. Ricky wants to share a Christmas gift with his crush Nicole, who ends up shooting him down until she starts seeing things from his perspective, albeit in an illegal and rather confusing way. But the premise still sounds kinda nice enough on its own, so maybe this could stand a chance, right?
You might be smart with books, but you sure are stupid.
Even with the more potentially smoother story, the writers still found ways to screw it up. There's a variety of unnecessarily padding shots or adding filter shots in general. There's dialogue that comes off extremely confusing and kinda lazy sounding at times. Oh, and who could forget the true MVP of the story, Grandma.
You just got for it.
What?
Then there's the cast, and this is where we get to see some real polar opposites between these movies. While Ferrera only reached out to people she was close with and their families to play the characters, J-Rose on the other hand went way farther. They were practically going all out with the cast, as they brought in some very recognizable actors, like Jodie Benson, Nancy Cartwright, Paige O'Hara, and even Mark Hamill. But even with all these big name actors together, it definitely wasn't enough to save the special. Just look at Todd. He's supposed to be one of the school bullies, and you'd think that someone as experienced as Nancy Cartwright might be able to pull off a decent enough performance.
Let's just see what Ricky Rhinemaster can do.
But instead, the voice she gave him was an awkward amalgamation of Simpson characters. And I know most of her recognition comes from The Simpsons, so of course we were bound to hear a few characters coming from her through this performance, even if it wasn't intentional. But couldn't she have stuck to a voice that gave off a bit more of a threatening feel? I mean, she did play Nelson. That could have worked. Or at least she could have used any voice that wasn't Ralph Wiggum. You know, the last character who would come to mind when it comes to a bully. But legitimately, one big saving grace Rapsittie Street Kid had was the soundtrack. But I'm not talking about the music. There were some songs thrown into the story, and they were surprisingly decent. Not good per se, but I'd call them doable at best. But then again, this is coming from a biased musical fanatic. Songs easily make me happy, so what do I know? With The Christmas Tree, however, the only saving grace I can think of is this line.
What a hangover.
Besides that, it was a brutal chore to sit through. Why did they have to include so many characters? More than half of them are easily forgettable. There's little to nothing about these kids that stand out. Or in a good way anyway. Judy basically does everything and Ray's just there. Why did Ray have to be there in the first place? We never see him do anything throughout the story. I know he's going about his own work, but we never get to see what kind of impact he makes to the story. If any, he just leaves at one point and doesn't come back until the very end. And even then, he's still made no difference. The way I see it, these movies have a kind of yin-yang pairing between each other. Like they both have advantages and disadvantages. Rapsittie Street Kids had terrible animation, but not as terrible a story. On the other hand, The Christmas Tree had a terrible story, but not as terrible animation. I'm not trying to say these elements were portrayed as good in either side of these, not by a long shot. But I feel it's fair to say as problematic as these elements were, they still have their ups and downs. When it came to the story for these movies, I feel that Rapsittie Street Kids had slightly better execution, because the writers were dealing with a much simpler premise. Just a simple scenario with a high school kid having a crush on someone, as well as that someone seeing a perspective outside of her own, learning from her mistakes and developing as she grows as a person. On paper, that sounds like it would have made a fairly good story. And I feel this would have had a slightly better chance if given the right amount of care and effort. But instead, we got unnecessary padding and questionable dialogue tossed in, and of course there were all those hideous CG models. And we ended up getting, well, this. As for The Christmas Tree, what did we get? A story about orphans with an unhealthy obsession for their tree to the point where magic happens. And sure, it was nice to see that these kids had something to care about, but don't you think they were going just a little too far with this tree? And that's the most linear way I can describe this story. Aside from that, it felt like the writers were confused and just started going all over the place. Alright, it's high time we wrap this up. So, which of these movies are worse? Which one will cause more suffering this Christmas season? Well, I don't want to speak for everyone, as I'm sure we all have varying opinions on these, but I'd have to say The Christmas Tree was still worse, but only by a little bit. Here's how I'd put it. The Christmas Tree is that kind of movie where it can be slightly tolerable if you leave it muted the whole time. At best, the animation can help make it just a little viewable, even if it's once in a while. But with Rapsittie Street Kids, looking at the screen is the last thing you'd want to do. You could look away if you need to, that's an option, but the writing can still be a problem. And the voice acting, while having its own issues, still has a few minor advantages. The characters' lines are easier to understand, their acting feels a bit more natural, even though, sure, there are still a few lazy performances, but I can still feel more effort was put out in this compared to The Christmas Tree. Plus, Mark Hamill seemed like he was enjoying himself, but knowing what he's capable of, that's pretty much natural. But the stories are what really determines them. As odd as it sounds, I feel Rapsittie Street Kids had a few elements that some people could probably relate to, but with more realistic circumstances, of course. However, The Christmas Tree had a more absurd premise with some lousy payoff and a poorly structured lesson at the end. Take this into consideration. it can be easier for a story to disguise its visuals than it is for the visuals to disguise its story. The Christmas tree was painful in just about every way. At best, I can say the animation looked like it could have worked sometimes, but even that had its problems, so it couldn't have disguised any of the other elements. But Rapsittie Street Kids was a different story. In that movie, the animation was so awful that it made all the other elements look a little more decent in comparison. So I guess I can compliment the animation in that regard, but that's really the best and briefest way I can sum these movies up. So this Christmas, do yourself a favor and try to stay away from these movies. There's only so much time in the day. It shouldn't be wasted on train wrecks like these, especially when there are plenty of far better movies and specials you can watch this festive season. Like The Grinch, Arthur's Perfect Christmas, Home Alone, A Charlie Brown Christmas, Jingle All the Way, A Christmas Story, and a handful of those Rankin Bass movies. And that's just a sample of things worth watching today. But regardless of what happens today, I'd still like to say Happy Holidays. And Merry Christmas to all, and to all...
Shut that door!
Wait, what?